Are you part of the great resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com. Then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and I guess in Joe Biden's America, having small children singing the national anthem at the U.S. Capitol is simply not allowed, even when a children's choir has made arrangements ahead of time to be able to sing America's national anthem inside the U.S. Capitol building. Now, in Donald Trump's America, that would have been perfectly okay, but I guess in Joe Biden's America, it's not. Let me give you the details in just a moment. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you on board for a little honestly provocative talk for the United States of America. And if you want to join the best conversation around, it's right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And a big welcome to our newest Lars affiliate. That's KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM and 580 AM in Boise, Idaho. Glad to have you on board as well. And a shout out to our friends in Laurel, Mississippi, where they listen on the Super Talk Network at WLAU. That's FM 99.3 in Laurel, Mississippi. Sir Winston, my studio dog, is from Pontotoc. You can find great talk radio on WLAU, and you can find my show there Monday through Friday. Let me tell you what's coming up this hour, and then I'll get to those kids who interrupted the business of the United States Capitol by singing our national anthem. First, later on this hour, a Chinese warship, as you may have heard this weekend, came dangerously close to a U.S. ship just a couple of days after a Chinese aircraft almost hit a U.S. fighter jet. Were those two incidents just an accident, or is that China flexing its muscle and testing the boundaries? I would go with the latter rather than the former. The House Oversight Committee has moved to hold FBI Director Christopher Wray in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with a subpoena. But will anything come of it? Let me mention this. When Christopher Wray at the FBI, which is a government agency, the Congress has both the authority and the responsibility to keep an eye on every federal agency in Washington, D.C., even the CIA. And when the FBI says, buzz off, pound sand, Congress, we're not giving you that document. And then the chair of the committee says, if you don't, we're going to pursue contempt charges. And Christopher Wray says, okay, I'll give it to you Monday. And then he shows up and says, I'm not giving you the document. But they did get a look at it, and the contempt charges are going to be pursued. Good for them. Every FDA-approved drug is covered by Medicare, except for one treatment for Alzheimer's. If you've wondered why that is the case, I'd be glad to tell you the details a bit later on this hour. And you can find my Twitter poll. Today's question, and I know that a lot of people who buy guns or own guns have wondered about that. I've wondered about it myself. Now, it doesn't actually apply to me. I do buy guns. I do have to sign a Form 4473. But on that form, it asks you to answer a number of different questions, like whether or not you're a convicted felon, whether or not you've been accused of domestic abuse, whether or not you're an illegal alien. And I kind of wonder how many illegal aliens actually answer yes to that question. But if you answer yes on any of those questions, you don't get to buy a gun. But one of the questions is whether or not you are a user or have recently used drugs that are illegal under federal law. Well, one of those drugs is marijuana. I don't use marijuana. Don't have I guess, a bud in that fight, if you will. I don't like pot. I think pot makes people become psychotic, and that's not just say reefer madness. There are actually great medical studies that I mention on the show that say that when you use the current grade of marijuana that is sold legally for recreation in so many states right now, still illegal under federal law, that it makes a greater number of especially young people become psychotic, which doesn't seem very healthy to me. But one of the questions that may have occurred to you is if you live in a state where marijuana for recreational use has been made legal, if you use that drug that is legal under state law but still illegal under federal law, and then you walk in to buy a gun, and they ask you, are you using drugs that are illegal to use under federal law? If you answer yes to that question, you're not going to be able to buy a gun. And a lot of us who've bought guns, as I have, and continue to buy guns because I have a great collection and I want to keep on building it slowly but surely, we've wondered whether or not the BATFE, or as it's more commonly known, ATF, should be a convenience store, but it's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They warned in an advisory last week that Minnesota residents who use marijuana, even legal under state law, cannot legally own firearms, despite the fact that Minnesota has made it legal. I think that's perfectly fine. Every time somebody calls this show, usually you can tell within a few seconds that they sound like a stoner. Sometimes they don't, but oftentimes they do. Hey, man, I don't know why you're so down on the weed. Oh, you must be a user. Oh, how'd you know that, man? I'm going to tell you something. It's funny to get those calls. But we've wondered, well, if the state says it's legal, but the federal government says it's not, does that apply to buying a gun? The BATFE warned last week that Minnesota residents who use pot can't legally own firearms. So I'd ask you the question this way in our Twitter poll: should the federal government forbid pot smokers from owning guns? I would answer yes. And here's the fix to it. For all you people who like to, as they say, partake, fine. You want to make it legal? Get the members of Congress to vote for it. Now, the number you need is 218 members of the House of Representatives. Then, of course, you need 51 over in the Senate, and you need Joe Biden, who I'm sure Joe Biden with a cokehead son probably wouldn't have any problem with marijuana at all. But you don't have that number of members of Congress. And I've had people call the show, and they'll swear and be damned. A majority of Americans want this stuff legalized. I said, then tell them to tell their members of Congress. Well, there aren't enough. The last time I talked to a member of Congress specifically about that issue, I said, you need 218 votes. How many do you have? And this member of Congress said, we have 168. I said, sounds like you're about 50 short. Or if you want to put it this way, you're about 30% short of being able to have the numbers necessary to pass the bill in the House. So you're out of luck, right? You don't have the votes in Congress, you can't change the law. Until you change the law, it's illegal at the federal level. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem if they continue to make it illegal, but it does create a problem for people who say, but I should be able to buy a gun. Okay, then get the law changed. Until then, you're out of luck. You'll find the question at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. It's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I've always believed in. I joined the group years and years ago. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, on First Amendment Friday, I'd ask you this: should failed politicians and prosecutors be teaching the next generation? I gave you two examples. Chesa Boudin, the son of terrorists who failed as DA in San Francisco and was recalled even by liberal San Francisco voters. He's been hired to teach criminal law at UC Berkeley. Lori Lightfoot, failed Chicago mayor, has been hired by Harvard. Absolutely crazy stuff. Coming up in just a moment, the FDA has approved a brand new drug for Alzheimer's, but Medicare refuses to cover it. Have you ever wondered why? We're going to tell you why next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I wonder about Alzheimer's. There are very few people in this country who don't either know somebody, even have somebody in the family who suffers because of Alzheimer's. So it might surprise you to find out the FDA has approved a brand new drug that might help out millions of Americans diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So one government agency says the drug's a good drug. There it is. And then another government agency, Medicare, is saying, but we're not going to cover the cost. And we wanted to find out why. So I called Sue Peshin, who is president and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research. Sue, welcome back to the program.
Lars, it's great to see you, and thanks so much for having me again.
So tell me this, why is the formal name is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services? Why is CMS saying no to funding this?
Well, they are very focused on financial risk over patient risk. And that's part of what, we've tried to bring some attention to. And I think this is kind of a stark example of that.
Well, so in shorthand, it means our government, which draws paychecks from all of us as taxpayers, is saying the money we spend is more important than the people we serve?
Essentially, they're making calculations on certain groups of people, and when products come through the FDA, they're picking and choosing. This is sort of a cherry-picked, arbitrary, and capricious, is what we're calling it, decision. It's something that they really created on their own as a decision to make. It's not something that's in federal statute, and they've just decided that for beneficiaries with early Alzheimer's, if they want access, then they have to enter into these really complicated clinical studies that'll be heavily restricted in order to ration care and save Medicare some bucks.
So tell me this, when it comes to studies, I mean, I don't know that much about medicine or science, but I do know that if you're going to do a study, you have the group that gets the drug, and then you have the controlled group that doesn't get the drug, so you can study how much better off is the group that got the treatment. Are they literally telling you go into a study and you may end up getting the sugar pill instead of the real deal, and you're going to be stuck with this illness? Is that what they're going to do?
Well, there's two different avenues that they created based on how the FDA approved the drug. And the fact of the matter is, if FDA approves the drug, it's approving the drug for safety and effectiveness. But they have one avenue that they've had for years. It was actually created around the time of HIV/AIDS, called accelerated approval. And that allows the approval process to be a little quicker than it might be for, a psoriasis drug where you might have a number of options already. So
Right.
This is an approval pathway for conditions where patients either have no options or maybe they've run out of options, like in the case of recurrent cancers. And it's primarily been used in the HIV/AIDS space and in cancer and for a lot of rare diseases. But for this new Alzheimer's therapy, the FDA used it because there were no disease-modifying therapies before these came along in this particular class. And CMS just took it upon itself to sort of pounce on it and say, we've been wanting to not have to pay as much for these types of drugs. Here's an example. So we're going to create this separate pathway. On the one hand, we're going to say, yeah, for drugs approved through accelerated approval, you got to be in these clinical trials. Now, the second drug in this class is about to go through traditional approval, which is how most drugs go through approval at the FDA. For those drugs, CMS is saying, well, we'll cover it a little more broadly, but we're still going to make these different conditions around it. It can only be given in certain places, only certain doctors can administer it, and everybody's got to join a registry. So it's still going to be highly restricted. It's not the same as a drug that you can just have coverage for. People are still going to have to jump through hoops.
I'm talking to Sue Peshin, who's president and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research, about a brand new drug approved by the FDA, but not approved by Medicaid or Medicare, because CMS oversees both of those. Can we do some numbers, and can you share with me how much cost are they really avoiding by saying, let's let some people use this, but not as many people as might benefit from it? How much money are we talking about? Is it $1 billion? Is it 10 billion? Is it 100 billion? Do you have any, if they were to fully roll it out to everybody in America who's early onset Alzheimer's, who might benefit from this, how much money are we talking about?
Yeah, it's not really clear because they haven't been clear with the American people about how closely they're going to restrict it yet. But I will tell you that some of the other types of therapies that are under this coverage with evidence development, that's what it's called under Medicare, they have limited to a couple hundred people, or in some cases a couple thousand. But with folks with mild cognitive impairment and early dementia due to Alzheimer's, there's as many as about close to 1 million people with that. So it is a lot of people. So from their perspective, they'll be saving hundreds of millions of dollars, probably.
Hundreds of millions, but not billions, right?
Well, it remains to be seen. It'll be probably at least hundreds of millions. But the problem is every day it's estimated that about 2,000 beneficiaries that have early Alzheimer's are going to lose the chance to benefit from these therapies the longer this goes on. 2,000 every day.
So they're condemning these people.
That's how they're saving. That's right. That's how they're saving this money.
See, and when I think about that, when you have a government that spends $6 trillion a year and says we can't afford a few hundred million to take care of this. Again, I don't have a direct dog in the fight. I don't know anybody today who has Alzheimer's, but I have known people in the past that when you say we're going to condemn these people, and once they're past early onset, then the drug won't do them any good anymore, and then CMS won't have to make the decision anymore. I could think of 1,000 things the federal government spends billions of dollars on that I wouldn't consider near as important as helping people avoid this, or at least slow down the progress, because that's what this drug does, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the studies have shown that it delays the progression of the disease by about 27%. In an 18-month trial. And that's a good amount of time for people, especially when they're earlier on in the disease. It can help them continue to maintain independence, their sense of dignity, the ability to do a lot of things on their own. You know, we all deserve that if that's if we're faced with Alzheimer's disease, to have more time. And that's really what patients are asking for from Medicare.
Well, and by the way, Sue, how much does the treatment cost? If somebody wanted to go out and just buy it as a prescription drug, have their doctor do it and do it out of pocket, is it anything that the average person could actually afford?
It's the second drug. It's called the Leqembi, is priced at $26,500 per year.
Wow.
So it is pricey, but I will say, there are cancer therapies like CAR T therapy that CMS pays for that are closer to $500,000 a pop. It's just that there are way less patients. And in terms of, the advocacy capability of that community, it's much more powerful than folks with Alzheimer's. Family caregivers, they call it the longest day when it comes to caring for somebody with Alzheimer's disease. So, they figure they don't have folks that have a lot of fight in them.
Yeah, it sounds like they've picked a very good victim class and said, we're just not going to help you and you're not going to be able to fight back much. Sue, thanks for what you do. That is Sue Peshin, the president and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research. Brand new drug approved by the FDA, but Medicare and Medicaid says, we're not going to use the people's money to actually serve the people. Does any naysayer out there think that's the right decision? Because I don't. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
Given the severity and complexity of the allegations contained within this record, Congress must investigate further. Americans have lost trust in the FBI's ability to enforce the law impartially and demand answers, transparency, and accountability.
That is Chairman James Comer, representative in the House of Representatives. He is the chair of the House Oversight Committee. He's going to begin the process of holding the FBI director, Christopher Wray, in contempt of Congress, even though they have seen the document they asked for, even though they have been briefed by the FBI. Because they subpoenaed the document, Christopher Wray said, I'll bring it over. I'll let you look at it. You can't keep it. You can't keep notes on it. This is the intransigence of an agency like the FBI that I think an awful lot of Americans do not believe the FBI. In fact, Comer spoke to that today, and I want to play that soundbite where he talks about why Americans do not believe the FBI. Listen to that.
There's no merit to this. This is crazy. This is a conspiracy theory. And you're just supposed to take my word or the FBI's word. I'm supposed to take the FBI's word that they're investigating this, or that you're going to write that the source is unverified, whatever. Remember, the main reason they're not wanting to make this public is because they're concerned about the source, the highly credible, and I haven't read that in a lot of outlets, the highly credible source that's been with the Bureau since the Obama administration.
Now, consider that. The FBI has a rock-solid source. Now, like all sources, there's still a source. But the FBI gets this information from a source that says that then Vice President Joe Biden and a foreign national, a foreign citizen, talked about a $5 million criminal scheme in which Joe Biden and the Biden crime family, when Joe was vice president, would end up getting a bribe. Now, the question is, if the FBI knew about it and they have investigated it and the investigation is over, then the Congress should have no problem getting a chance to look at that document. Will it be made public? I doubt that, because in some ways, it's like a police agency that's investigating something. Even when their investigation is done, they still may not want to share the source, because at that point, you wreck that source of information, if it's a good source. If they truly investigated this after they created this document, the FD 1023, that alleges the $5 million bribery scheme involving Joe Biden, well, then fine. If they investigated it, they found there was no reason to believe what was alleged in there, except they're going to have to explain how an FBI source who was viewed by the FBI as being completely trustworthy would give them this information. They would look into it and find that the information was a whole bunch of bunk. So listen to what Comer, James Comer, the chair of the committee, says about the Biden crime family.
Could they end up showing more Biden family business dealings with other countries?
This document was dated, I think you all know this, from the subpoena in July 30th, 2020. The claims made in the document are consistent with what we found and disclosed to you all in Romania. It suggests a pattern of bribery where payments would be made through shell accounts and multiple banks. There's a term for that. It's called money laundering. And that, again, is what the majority of the suspicious activity reports also said. So we feel that this accusation is consistent with a pattern that we're seeing, frankly, in other countries, too.
Now, think about what we're talking about. On this show, we've talked about what are called suspicious activity reports, SARs. Now, I could generate a suspicious activity report. Let's say I walked into my bank. I don't have this kind of cash, but if I walked into my bank and I made a cash deposit of $15,000, I know to a fair certainty my bank would, from that $15,000 deposit, send off an SAR. They'd send it to law enforcement, and law enforcement might actually look at it, say, where did Lars put his hands on $15,000 in cash? And if I said, well, I had this big garage sale, and there were a bunch of people that wanted my old used snow tires and a few of my tools, and I got $15,000 in cash. You know that's hogwash. So Hunter Biden and the Biden crime family have generated literally hundreds of these suspicious activity reports, which means something was going on. In other words, Hunter Biden, we know for a fact, did deals in Ukraine. He sat on a board of directors, got paid an extraordinary amount of money, about $1 million a year, when even a big name publicly held company in America might pay you a couple of $100,000 a year to sit on their board of directors. Burisma, the natural gas company in Ukraine, was paying Hunter Biden hundreds of thousands of dollars, $83,000 a month, about $1 million a year. So why does it make sense? Why does it make sense that when that money comes back to the United States and Hunter Biden and his dear old dad, the vice president, who was having meetings with some of Hunter Biden's business associates, despite the fact that Joe Biden always denied that he had any business dealings involving his son at all. He flatly denied it. He said, my son and I don't talk about business. I don't have any contacts with his business associates. And we know that all of that was a big pack of lies, because we now have pictures of Joe Biden meeting with Hunter Biden's business associates. There are other records that have been pried loose by James Comer and other members of the House Oversight Committee. And now we got the FBI saying, we don't want to show you this document because it might actually indicate that the current sitting president of the United States was involved in a $5 million bribery scheme, and that it was happening when he was vice president years ago. It makes all the other things like Teapot Dome and Watergate and the rest look small by comparison. And why is the FBI protecting the Biden crime family? No way to know that just yet. But I will tell you this. One of the most significant things that came out today was Comer talking about the FBI's ongoing investigation. Listen to that.
All I know is there's an ongoing investigation. They confirmed there's an ongoing investigation using this information. I assume that ongoing investigation is in Delaware. I don't know that, but I assume that.
I assume that. Now, why is that important? I'll tell you why. Because if Joe Biden and the Biden crime family can get the FBI to protect them long enough, if they get past the statute of limitations for whatever crimes they might have been accused of, then we have the same situation that we had with Hillary Clinton, who admitted to destruction of public documents, federal documents, a crime that is a crime in the United States to destroy public documents. Hillary Clinton confirmed that she destroyed public documents, and she did it knowingly and then joked about it. You mean I wiped my computer servers like with a cloth? Yes, you did. And what happened then? Well, James Comey, who's made a ton of money after he left the FBI in disgrace by doing a book and a speaking tour and all that, he just thinks he's so clever because he managed to pull off these crimes, and now we're going to watch the statute of limitations evaporate. That's the kind of America that we're living in today. An America where even a little kid's choir can't sing the national anthem in the U.S. Capitol building. Glad to have you with me. Always glad to take your calls. Got a little advice for you, though. Father's Day, right around the corner. Get Dad what he really wants. Omaha steaks, perfectly aged, always tender, guaranteed delicious. The Father's Day experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easy to put a smile on the big guy's face this summer with hand-selected packages. Head over to omahasteaks.com. Use promo code LARS, L-A-R-S, at checkout. Get $30 off your qualifying order. You can choose from a variety of mouth-watering packages. Fork tender filet mignon with bacon wrapped around it. Other gourmet grillables like air-chilled boneless chicken breasts and burgers and jumbo franks and so much more. And don't forget to save room for dessert. Most of those gift packages come with 4 delicious caramel apple tartlets. Do what I do. Go to omahasteaks.com. Use my name, Lars, at checkout. Get $30 off an unforgettable gift, guaranteed to make Dad's day, because dads want steak. omahasteaks.com, promo code Lars. Minimum order required. See the site for details. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I always tell you that I will admit if I have a dog in the fight. I'm not crazy about communist China. I don't like the government of that country. I don't have anything in particular against the people of that country, but their government is about as bad as it gets. I also like Taiwan, the Republic of China, the independent little country off the coast of mainland China. I was born there because my mom and dad were in the U.S. Navy. So I put that disclosure up there so you know I've got a bias in this one. Miles Yu is a senior fellow and director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute, and I want to talk to Miles about some of these close calls that we've had just recently. One Chinese warship coming within 150 yards of a U.S. destroyer in the Taiwan Strait, used to call it the Formosa Strait, and then, of course, a very close call with a couple of fighter jets up in the air. Miles, it's good to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Lars.
Why?
You're not the only one, by the way. You're not the only one who doesn't like Chinese communist government. Most of the people in China don't like the Chinese government.
I imagine, and we'd love to give them another option, but we don't want to go to war with the mainland Chinese. We'd like them to start behaving like a decent country. But tell me this, what is going on with these close calls, and is this deliberate on the part of the PROC?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a deliberate because no Chinese soldiers or pilots can act independently without some kind of policy guidance from above. What it is this: China claimed almost the entire South China Sea as its own. They claim the entire Taiwan Strait as its sovereign water, and those are international commons. So United States followed the international law and fly and sail in those waters, which virtually no other country has this problem except China. So they believe that we are really infringing upon their sovereignty. This is ridiculous. And as you say, on May 26th, a little bit over a week ago, China flew a J-16 fighter jet, basically harassing an American reconnaissance plane over international water. Of course, a few days ago, the Chinese destroyer almost deliberately crashed into the American Arleigh Burke class destroyer, a USS Chung-Hoon.
Well, let me ask you this, Miles. Is this comparable at all, let's say, to the United States and Cuba? We have a relatively short span, 80 or 100 miles between the two of those. But the U.S., while that's within our territorial waters, we don't try to tell other countries they can't steam through those waters, do we?
Well, this is even worse than that. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union fought each other globally. But we knew there is this severe consequence of mutual destruction. So the United States and the Soviet Union actually worked out quite an elaborate system of accidental clash, and there's a rule of engagement in the high sea and in the air. So we even have open sky, treaty where that the United States would be able to fly in reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory and vice versa. So China doesn't play game. I mean, it's not even just play hard to get. China deliberately trying to create a confrontation. I mean, so this is very dangerous, and I think the Chinese Communist government does not understand what severe consequences this might bring, not only to the United States, but most importantly to themselves.
By the way, Miles Yu is a senior fellow and director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute. But they know what the game is, but they're trying to test the limits and say, how far can we push the United States without getting a severe pushback? And they're trying to normalize the idea that we would stay out of what they have claimed as their waters in the South China Sea?
That's one part of the calculation. Another part is China has this traditional strategy of use confrontation to extract concession, which means that the Biden administration has shown its excessive eagerness to engage China, to talk with China, to have a dialogue. So they look at this as a weakness. So therefore, they kind of bullying the United States, hoping that the Biden administration would make more concessions. So this is basically, what they consider as a win-win. They try to be cantankerous and provocative, in hope that the United States will just concede outright or basically bargain with China at the dialogue table.
Well, and so when you have a couple of ships, the USS Chung-Hoon and the Canadian frigate, the Montreal, and they were doing freedom of navigation, basically steaming through the Taiwan Strait to say this is international waters and we're going to drive through or sail through so that we make it clear these are international waters, there's freedom of navigation, and you're not going to harass us. And China's response is to say we're going to harass you as much as we possibly can, hoping to provoke an incident. Is that where they're headed?
Well, I don't think it's in China's best interest to provoke incident, but they're trying to do is they play the brinksmanship. That's what is dangerous, right? It's a very difficult. It's very important for them to understand. This kind of incident can create complete miscalculation about strategic intent of the other side. And once you have this, once the incident turns into some kind of shooting, and then nobody can control the escalation, and that's really the danger. Now, what China has done so far is basically, as I say, brinksmanship. This is interesting because when China is conducting this kind of risk business at high sea, in the meantime, the Chinese defense minister in Singapore's defense dialogue, it's called the Shangri-La Defense Dialogue, and he was saying, China actually stresses dialogue over confrontation. In the meantime, confrontation is being created by China. So, I mean, they're basically saying the same two things at the both sides of the mouth. It's just at the height of hypocrisy. This is very dangerous.
It sounds like it. Miles, thank you very much. We always appreciate your insights. That's Miles Yu at the Hudson Institute and the China Center. Hey, by the way, if you're buying that name brand CBD right now, write down this website, genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. Make the switch to generic CBD and save money big time, up to 75%. Their products are fantastic. On a side note, they sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. My wife and I love generic CBD. It retails for $100. It's on sale right now for $39.95, but you can try it free. That's right, free. Just pay $2.95 for shipping. This penetrating cream melts right into your muscles and joints, including your knees, your elbows, and your lower back. You won't believe how fast it goes to work. Plus, it doubles as one of the best moisturizers I've ever tried. Try it for yourself. You'll love it. And don't worry, it's not a subscription. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com. Get the sample headed your way right now. See what this amazing CBD cream can do for you. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. So they keep telling you that you have to get the jab, and then you have to get the booster, and after that, another booster and another booster. Are all those boosters screwing up your health and your immunity? There's a brand new study that I want to tell you all about. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Glad to have you on board, and always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you happen to be a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line. We always have, we always will. At 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And a big welcome to our newest Lars affiliate, this one in Boise, Idaho, the home of Kevin Miller, who does a great talk show on KIDO every morning. And I'll be doing the talk show there in the evening. Glad to have you on board. KIDO Talk Radio 107.5 FM and 580 AM. Of course, we've got affiliates all over America. And if you can't find the show, go to our website. Download the podcast or stream it live, whatever you like, however you get it. We're glad to have you on board for honestly provocative talk radio for America. And a shout out to Powell, Wyoming, where they listen to great talk radio on KPOW. That's AM 1260. And of course, you can listen to my show Monday through Friday. Glad to have you on board. I'll get to the COVID boosters in a moment. Let me tell you what's going on this hour. Joe Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in federal student loan debt for about 43 million Americans remains on hold as the U.S. Supreme Court considers its fate. The hearing on that is coming up in a couple of days on a Thursday. I've told you before that if you made the decision to go to college, good for you. If you got to choose your major, what you wanted to study, and you saw the value in it, good for you. But you made that decision. You're over 18. You can read, write, and count. So it's your decision. You spent a bunch of money to get a degree that doesn't actually lead to a profession that makes it easy to pay the money back. That's your problem. It is not the problem of the rest of the American taxpayers, most of whom have never sat in a college classroom, most of whom didn't get the advantage you got, and now you have the temerity to turn around and tell them, I got to go to college, you get to pay the bill. I'd love to hear a naysayer make a solid case in favor of that nonsense. Why didn't Attorney General William Barr pursue a whistleblower's claims of blatant electoral misconduct by a government agency? I think Bill Barr did a terrible job as Attorney General for that reason alone. We'll get into the details a bit later on this hour. And as Joe Biden's prescription reform program actually lowered prices at cost-cutting for drug innovation and cures for killer diseases, we'll talk about that as well. He's been killing the cures instead. And take just a moment to cast a vote in our Twitter poll. We put up a brand new question each and every day. Here's the way the question goes, then I'll give you the background. Should the federal government forbid those who smoke pot from owning guns? Well, it turns out a lot of us have asked this question, not because I use pot. I don't like pot. I never have. But I want to know whether or not you think it should be legal for somebody who consumes marijuana that is legal at the state level but is not legal at the federal level. When you walk into that gun store and you say, I want to buy a pistol or a rifle or a shotgun, and they put a Form 4473 in front of you. If you've ever bought a gun, you're familiar with the form. It asks you all kinds of questions that are disqualifiers for buying a gun. One of those is, are you a user of illicit narcotics? And one of those narcotics under federal law is marijuana. So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, put an advisory out last week that said that even though Minnesota, as an example, has legalized marijuana for recreational use, you're still not allowed to own a gun. Not if you're a user of cannabis, you can't buy a gun. So, should the federal government forbid pot smokers from owning guns? I would answer that question yes, and tell you if you want to make it legal, get members of Congress to vote for a change in the law. Until then, you got to follow the law. Our Twitter poll is found at Lars Larson Show and is brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in, so I joined a long time ago. You can join too. It's very easy. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, on First Amendment Friday, I ask you the question about whether or not failed politicians and failed prosecutors should be teaching the next generation. I gave you the two examples. Chesa Boudin, who was DA in San Francisco until he was recalled by the voters who saw what a disaster he had made of the place. He's now been hired to be the head of criminal law at UC Berkeley. And failed Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who made Chicago, believe it or not, even more dangerous than it was before she arrived. She's been hired by Harvard to teach classes on health and public safety policy. I would say no to the idea they should not be teaching the next generation. 93% of you joined me in that no vote. Only 7% of you said yes to the idea. Find the question at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Glad to have you with me. Let me tell you about the COVID booster, but first, a confession. I always tell you if I have a dog in the fight, I didn't take the jab. I don't believe in it. The mRNA vaccine, so-called, that isn't really a vaccine, doesn't stop you from getting COVID, doesn't stop you from transmitting COVID, doesn't necessarily keep you out of the hospital or keep you from dying. There are too many examples to the contrary. What has happened now? Epoch Times reports there's a brand new study out that shows that repeated COVID-19 vaccination weakens the immune system, potentially making people susceptible to life-threatening conditions like cancer, according to a brand new study. Multiple doses of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine led to higher levels of antibodies. They're called IgG4, and they can provide a protective effect. But the multiple boosters weaken that. A growing body of evidence indicates that abnormally high levels, that's a quote from the study, of immunoglobulin subclass actually makes the immune system more susceptible to the COVID-19 spike protein in the vaccines, according to the researchers who published this paper. Studies have detected higher levels of IgG4 in people who died with COVID when compared to those who recovered, and linked the levels to another determinant of COVID-19 mortality. A review of the literature also shows the vaccines against HIV, malaria, and pertussis also induce the production of that IgG4 chemical. That is something to be very, very concerned about. Glad to have you with me and always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Consider this question. Should there be harsh punishment for those people who disrupt wildlife? Yellowstone National Park rangers are once again warning the public not to approach wildlife. They were forced to investigate an incident where somebody, get this, literally loaded up a calf elk, a baby elk if you want to call it that, and brought it to a local police station. Happened during Memorial Day weekend. Visitors placed an elk calf in their car while they were driving on U.S. Highway 191 in the park. They brought the newborn calf elk to the police department in West Yellowstone. The incident is under investigation. Coming up in a moment, the fate of Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness plan will be determined in a matter of weeks. Is the Supreme Court going to shoot it down or give all those borrowers, deadbeats, a free pass? We'll talk about that coming up next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I have my usual confession to make that if I have a dog in the fight, I went to college for about a year and a half, about 1,000,000 years ago, and I paid for it myself. So I don't think much of people who say, I want to go to college, I want to borrow a lot of money, I want to have the U.S. government back that loan, and then when it comes due, and I say, gee, I studied some crazy stuff like beetle tracking or button sorting or underwater basket weaving, and it turns out the degree doesn't actually bring a job that lets me easily pay the loan back, I'd like to have somebody else pay the loan off. I'm not in favor of that. It is Joe Biden's promise to about 43 million Americans that he's going to take your money, including a lot of money from people who never sat in a college classroom, and use it to pay off the foolish loans of people who got a degree that really wasn't worth what they paid for it. On that note, Elaine Parker joins me now, who's president of the Job Creators Network Foundation. Elaine, good to have you back.
Thanks so much for having me, Lars.
So the Supreme Court has heard the arguments put forward in your challenge to the Biden student loan forgiveness program, so-called, and you've actually gone a step that I didn't go, and that is you've said that an awful lot of these colleges were simply gouging the students, charging them more because they knew that the cost would be backed up by the government. So does that pretty well encapsulate the Job Creators Network arguments against this payoff, this bailout?
Well, not the legal arguments. Obviously, the legal arguments are very different, and it has to do with the president just simply not having the authority to spend $400 billion of taxpayer money to pay off the loans of millions of Americans by just going into a back room and making up a rule. That's what our legislative process is for. This is a job for Congress to decide what to do about this crisis. Now, on your other point, we agree that there's a crisis and we agree that there needs to be a solution, but we just don't agree that taxpayers should be on the hook for this. These colleges and universities are sitting on $700 billion with a B
Wow.
in endowments. All the while, they are increasing tuition far past twice the rate of inflation over the last few decades, to be exact. And they raise the tuition at twice the inflation. All the while, they pay their presidents of the colleges $1 million plus. They pay football coaches tens of millions of dollars. They build Taj Mahals across their campuses, gold-plated resort-style Taj Mahals, all on the backs of these students. And there's no measurement of success on the degree programs that are being created. And lastly, why is the federal government in the student loan program anyway? They shouldn't be there. This is where banks should come in, and banks should be lending dollars, not loans that are 100% backed up by colleges. These colleges should have some skin in the game. They should actually have to underwrite portions of these loans, and then we wouldn't see these degree programs come out that have no return on investments for these students.
I'm with you all the way on that because, Elaine, for a long time, probably 25 years, I've proposed every now and then I'll say, here's an idea, but it kind of comes at it from the consumer end. You say, let's have every kid, who's in high school, sit down and do an exercise. It'll take all of 45 minutes. And what they do is they have a form. They say, when I graduate from high school, I want to become an X, whatever the X is, teacher, nurse, whatever, PA. And then you say, to do that, I plan to attend, and then you can name off 3 of your favorite places to go and get that education. And say that education currently costs so much per year. I'll need 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, and it's going to cost a grand total of this. And here's how I'm going to raise the money. I'll work summers and make this much. Mom and dad have said they'll give me this much. Grandma and grandpa will give this much. I'll borrow the rest on student loans, which will, when I graduate, cost me this much money per month. And looking up that job today, the job pays, whatever the job pays right now. And if it pencils, the student can see for themselves, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to spend $150,000 to get a job as a docent at a museum for $15 an hour. Say, no, that one doesn't pencil. You want to get your master's of fine arts, you're going to have to get it some other way. And you're suggesting that what the colleges should have to do is say to the young man or woman, look, we're on the hook for part of this, so We want you to study something that actually leads to a career that will let you readily, not necessarily easily, but readily pay the money back. So when the kid says, well, this is what I want to do, they say, no, that doesn't lead to a job that'll let you pay. The same way a bank would if I approached them or you approached them, Elaine, said, I'd like to get a small business loan. They say, well, what do you plan to sell? And what's it going to cost? And what's your marketplace? Show us a business plan or we're not giving you a dime. Does that get there or get near to where you're suggesting we ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, something like that, something along those lines. These colleges, they have zero skin in the game, and the spigots are wide open from the federal government with just, it's not free money, but easy money. Whatever it is, whatever degree program it is, these students can borrow tens of thousands of dollars. And you tell me, did you understand at 18 years old what it would have meant to borrow $50,000 and sign your life away?
No. And I didn't do it as a result.
Exactly. These are 18-year-olds signing contracts where there's not full disclosure. Some of these are predatory loans. These students don't understand, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, they probably don't understand at 18 years old what it means to pay back $40,000 or $50,000. I mean, that is just being saddled with this for the rest of your life, basically. And you think about not being able to buy a house in the future because you're saddled with this humongous debt your whole life. And this is the crisis we're dealing with. And we're over $1 trillion in student loans. And if taxpayers are put on the hook for this, it will signal to colleges and universities that they can continue increasing their tuition at rates that are unsustainable, and they're price gouging these students to death.
I agree with you. And Elaine, because if you said to the college, you got some skin in the game, and the college says, we won't let the kids take whatever they want to take. You say, no, we need to have the kids take something that will pay the loan back. Now, if a kid walks in from a wealthy family and says, hey, I want to become an archaeologist, and they say, well, the average archaeologist makes, this much money, and you're asking to borrow $200,000, we're not going to do that. If you walk in with a lot of money, okay, fine, you can study whatever you want. But it has to be that way because money has a way of making people make decisions. I mean, I've literally been with friends in New York. I mean, I've been there in a few years, but I was walking down the street with a producer, and he said, how about we go in here for a burger or something to eat? And he looked at the menu outside and said, $21 for a burger? And he said, I'll go hungry for a while. Because you look at it, and every one of us has done that. Said, yeah, I'd like one of those. How much are they? Oh, thanks anyway. See you later. And you walk down the street. And it should apply to really big purchases like 5- and 6-figure college education, shouldn't it?
Exactly. I mean, look, there's a lot of fat that can be cut from colleges and universities to help lower student tuition. For instance, colleges have hired an army of high-paid administrators that really provide little to no educational value. Some colleges now actually have the same number of administrators as they do students, and most of the colleges have more administrators than faculty. So it makes you sort of wonder, have colleges just become glorified jobs programs that are funded by students and taxpayers potentially?
I agree with you. And this is the part I have a really tough time with, because when you calculate it out, most schools, I think, are about, they call it 180 hours you have to earn. And then you say, for how much? And if you say, well, $200,000, and I say, how much per hour is that? And how much of that actually goes to the person who's teaching me? And when I get the 4-color catalog that shows all the famous people on your faculty, are any of those people going to stand in front of a class, my class, for more than 20 minutes at the beginning of the term? Or is it actually going to be taught by graduate teaching fellows who make $30 or $40 an hour? And why am I paying $1,000 an hour to get an education from somebody who makes $30 or $40 an hour? None of that stuff sounds reasonable, and I'm so glad that the Job Creators Network is actually fighting on this one, Elaine. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lars.
Glad to have you on. Coming up in a moment, a long time ago, you heard on this show a man who is a truck driver, and he delivered hundreds of thousands of ballots across state lines, and people said that story is hogwash. Well, guess what? It's absolutely true, and now he's been vindicated. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. You might not remember this, but way back in about 2021, we talked to a guy by the name of Jesse Morgan. Now, we weren't the first to talk to him. I wish I could claim that I was, but I'm not. Jesse Morgan is a truck driver, and he drove a tractor trailer for a contractor that worked for the U.S. Postal Service. Okay, nothing big about that. He did a good job, minded his own business. Well, on October 21st, 2020, right before the notorious and I think flawed 2020 election, he drove his truck and trailer from Bethpage, New York to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was loaded with over 250,000 completed ballots. In addition, there were 2 large trays of mixed mail that was bound for Lancaster, PA. Those were in the front of the trailer. Jesse drove the trailer to Harrisburg, but was not allowed to unload. After a 6-hour wait, he was told to drive to Lancaster without unloading at Harrisburg. In addition, the supervisor in Harrisburg refused to give him any paperwork to document his arrival in Harrisburg or his 6-hour wait, which would normally justify extra compensation. Jesse Morgan didn't know what was going on with that because he says 95% of the load was for Harrisburg, and the mail would have to be unloaded before anybody else could get access to the Lancaster mail bins. After that, the Harrisburg mail would have to be returned to the trailer and driven to Harrisburg. Even for the government, as he says, this is slightly inefficient. This is Joe Freed at American Thinker. So, as instructed, he drove the tractor trailer to Lancaster and parked it in his usual spot. The next morning, the trailer had disappeared, the one with 288,000 completed ballots. The trailer and the ballots were gone, and nobody would tell Morgan or anybody else what happened. Now, we ended up talking to that man. We talked to also some of his lawyers about what happened. Now, as Freed points out, and I congratulate Joe Freed for putting all this together, because at the time, Mr. Morgan, Jesse Morgan, told a very convincing story, and I thought he was right, and it turns out he was. As Freed says, now you might think that's a yarn, a story that Morgan made up, but you'd be wrong. In its highly redacted closing memorandum, the Post Office Inspector General investigated. And he does not deny that Morgan was a subcontract truck driver who took mail from Bethpage to Harrisburg and then to Lancaster. The OIG claims that Morgan identified the wrong trailer number and that his estimate of ballots could be much lower. And there were other suspicious tidbits in the closing memo. In the document, the Office of the Inspector General acknowledges that a contractor in Rochester, New York, printed 650,000 general election ballots that went to Pennsylvania. Of the total, 450,000 went to Philadelphia, 200,000 to Chester County. In explaining how the printing company delivered the ballots, the OIG says the printing company explained but could not confirm the ballots for both PA were most likely delivered to those respective locations by delivery trucks. They can't tell you where the ballots went. Now, was it a government cover-up? What Joe Freed says is that Joe Hoft, and you've heard him on this show as well, Gateway Pundit, conducted a great interview of a retired intelligence officer, Tony Schaefer. Starting at about the 12-minute mark, Schaefer discusses his investigation of Jesse Morgan and Attorney General Bill Barr's threats that shut down the investigation. Early on, Schaefer was asked by members of the Pennsylvania Senate to thoroughly investigate the truck driver's claims. He formed a special team of former postmasters who spent a week trying to determine if his story was feasible given the normal post office procedure. They concluded it was feasible and that Morgan was credible. Schaefer then asked an acquaintance, former Attorney General Ed Meese, you've also heard him on this show a long time ago, to call Barr to tell him what happened. According to Schaefer, no more than 10 minutes went by before Barr called him to tell him stop investigating. Barr then spent 20 minutes essentially yelling at him in a threatening way. Schaefer asked if Morgan could get whistleblower status. Barr said no. After that, Morgan dropped out of sight. That was after we got a chance to interview him. Morgan later said the FBI basically harassed him, harassed his family, and wanted to know how I came on TV. Did they investigate? No sign of that. Final point. the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania certified the 2020 election, despite the undisputed fact, this is Joe Freed at American Thinker, that it recorded 202,000 more ballots than it had voters. That disparity probably made the election certification illegal under the Commonwealth law of Pennsylvania. Eventually, Pennsylvania found some more voters, but not enough. To this very day, he writes, it appears there were 91,000 more ballots cast than they had identified voters to match up with them. Of course, that number is greater than Joe Biden's winning margin, but it does lend credence to the claims of Jesse Morgan. But hey, let's not be small about all this. Glad to have you with me on a Monday. Always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And at the risk of angering the 420 crowd, the pot smokers, the question for today, should the federal government forbid pot smokers from owning guns? The law says that right now. And now the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, has warned people in Minnesota, even though the state has legalized pot, you still can't buy a gun. Anybody who's ever bought one, like me, has filled out a Form 4473. If you admit that you're using illegal narcotics, and that's illegal not under state law, but under federal law. Remember, we live in the United States of America. Your state can legalize pot. That's been done with kind of a wink and a nod over the years, but you understand that under federal law, it is still illegal. And if you want to change that, go to the U.S. Congress, get 218 votes in the Senate or in the House and 51 votes in the Senate, and get Joe Biden's signature, which I'm reasonably sure you could get. I want to tell you a couple of other small items they just need to be mentioned. The Bible has now been pulled from the shelves of libraries in a school district in Utah after a parent complained that the Bible could be considered pornographic. Now, my wife and I do Bible study almost every night of the week for about a half an hour to an hour, and we know the book reasonably well. There are parts of it that are very disturbing, but it is, in fact, the most published book on earth, and it is the revealed word of God, and so as a result, I don't find it pornographic. A teenage girl and her father, who were punished for what they call misgendering a biological boy in the girls' locker room, recently scored a victory in court. Blake Allen, a 15-year-old student athlete, was suspended last year for speaking out about how uncomfortable she was made by a male student allowed in the girls' volleyball locker room. The male student identifies as transgender. Allen was then a 14-year-old girl, was accused of harassing the male student after expressing her unhappiness to a fellow classmate. In other words, for expressing her First Amendment rights. That's wrong. By the way, are you a small business owner, and could you use a few $100,000? Employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out more than 1,500 small business owners, and those owners got about $300 million in extra funds. And they know what they're doing at Get My Funds. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. So if you retain 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. It is a tax refund. No upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds, 800-535-2950, getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Monday. Always glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Well, the Democrats claim that their Build Back Better plan will lower the cost of prescription drugs for families. But has it actually raised the price of new drugs and actually killed innovation, both in one strike? And I suggest that it probably has done that. Phil Kerpen joins me now, president of American Commitment. Phil, welcome back to the program.
My pleasure, Lars. Thanks for having me.
So you had Joe Biden, who came into office, canceled Donald Trump's program that actually did lower the cost of insulin, for example. I don't take insulin, although I'm a type 2. but I don't need insulin, so I don't have a dog in the fight. But Joe cancels that program that actually worked and then says he'll recreate it. Having recreated the problem, he'll create a solution. And then he had this prescription drug program that was also supposed to reduce the cost of drugs. What has it actually ended up doing?
Well, the biggest impact is that we've seen almost every single drug manufacturer cancel one or more clinical trials. And that's because when the government announces that in a couple of years they're going to start setting the prices for the most successful prescription drugs, the ones that Medicare spends the most money on, what that basically does is it changes the market incentives such that for most drugs, they're still going to have pricing power for the most part, although they're now subject to a new cap, which tends to mean you're going to go up. They're going to go up every year at the price of inflation when they had been going up less than that. But basically, you're telling these companies, if you have a big hit, if you cure something important, you're not going to get the reward for that because government's going to come in and set the price at a below market price. And the consequence of that is a lot less research, a lot less new cures are going to be developed, and that's going to be pretty bad news for people who have chronic diseases, people who have rare diseases, seniors, and so forth.
So, Phil, I'm confused by this. So what's the best move for the company if they say, if you have a big hit, we're going to come in and just drop the price back down? How do they end up responding? Do they just put everything on hold until some sensible government takes over again? Because what can they do?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think that on the margin, you're seeing a lot of trials canceled, as I said. Not all of them, so they're still continuing to do some research. They've got to have something in their pipeline for their business to, exist going forward. So you're not going to. It's not like you have zero, clinical trials going on, but you're going to have fewer.
No.
You're going to have probably hundreds of fewer new drugs developed over the next few years because of these rules.
Well, and Phil, I guess I've never been a drug executive, so I don't know for a fact, but there are an awful lot of companies that make money just making the old drugs. And if you tell them, don't develop any new ones because you won't be able to even recover the costs, let alone make a big profit, you could say, fine, we'll just crank out the stuff we've been cranking out. We still make money doing that. We spend a lot less money on things like research and clinical trials and everything else, and we'll just make, there are still companies that make money selling aspirin, for God's sake. Aspirin where it's out of patent, it's out of copyright, anybody can make it, and the margin on it probably isn't very big. But if you crank out enough billions of pills, I'm sure you can still make money on Bayer or whoever makes aspirin. It's commonly made. But if they tell the drug companies, don't go out and spend money, making new stuff because you won't make the big money back from it, is there a danger that the drug companies will say, fine, we'll just crank out the old stuff and we'll still make money, just not the way we would have?
Yeah, to a certain extent, and I think that's what we're seeing. The generics are kind of a different world, and they've got very small profit margins, as you noted, and it's intensely competitive. But for the brand name drugs, the ones that are still under patent protection, they typically will charge, whatever the market can bear. But, in recent years, it's been pretty competitive. Remember, there are lots of different Medicare Part D plans. They all negotiate. They all compete for seniors and so forth. And so drug prices were actually running about 2.5% annual increase when they passed this bill, while overall inflation was 5, 6, 7, 8%. So when you put a bill in that says now you're capped in terms of your price increases to the rate of inflation, well, almost every company is going to take the maximum every year because they don't know what the future holds, and they're not going to have pricing power in the future. So we're tending to see, as a consequence of what Biden did, in the near term at least, higher price increases than we otherwise would have seen on the drugs that already exist because they're taking the max out under the inflation cap.
Well, sure, because if you were going up at an average of 2.5%, you have a $10 drug, and it goes up, 25 cents every year. But if all of a sudden you're told you're going to be capped in what you can do, then you say, okay, we'll go to the max, we'll jack the price up. By the time the price controls roll in, then we'll already be at 12 or 15 bucks a pill. But then the increases will be limited, but we'll already have a higher cost basis. Is that the general idea?
Yeah, essentially, and everyone's sort of dealing with the same reality, and so I think the you don't have the same. What are my competitors doing? Everyone's pretty much moving towards that cap, and so in the near term, we are seeing upward price pressure as a result of that.
But in the meantime, how do we track? See, I've always told people I don't have it in for the pharma companies the way a lot of people do. I see them as like any other capitalist enterprise. Their job is to make money and coming up with new innovations. it's not like we're not in a society full of innovative companies, whether it's Apple or Microsoft or whoever. And I have my own opinions about the politics of the people who own those companies. But I say, great, they come up with new, latest, greatest stuff, and they charge appropriately to recover their costs, their fixed costs, or baked in costs of those products, saying, we make an Apple iPhone for a couple $100 in China, sell it for $1,000 or $1,500 in America. Nobody complains about that because they say, well, cell phones aren't essential, drugs are. Well, to a large degree, cell phones are essential, but nobody questions why a phone that only costs a couple of $100 to make is being sold for 4 or 5 times that much. Well, because you've got costs of design and coming up with new stuff. If you told the cell phone companies we're going to cap cell phones, they'd say, okay, we'll just take the current design and just make lots and lots of them, and we'll sell them cheaper. But when you wonder, well, are they going to make a better cell phone? The answer is no. That costs a lot of money. Is that a good comparison for it?
Yeah, I think it is. Look, the real tragedy of the Democrats' obsession with this is that the problems that we have in healthcare have almost all been driven by too much government, too little competition.
Agreed.
And drugs are, they're expensive, more expensive than they should be because they're so heavily regulated, and it's so expensive to get through the whole process at FDA. And if you're not a handful of companies with political stroke, it might actually be impossible, and you got to partner with one of the big boys. It's just a total disaster. Instead of fixing that, the Democrats come in and say, well, we'll just say, the most successful drugs are going to be capped and they're not going to be able to get a return. Well, when you do that, you dramatically decrease R&D. And historically, when Democrats have put these proposals forward, they've said, well, we're going to make up for it with some huge increase in NIH spending and government spending. Government will do the research and that'll make up for it. Well, you and I know government's never going to be as good at doing research that actually yields something helpful as the private industry will be. But they didn't even do that in the bill they passed last year. They didn't even try to replace it. This bill is estimated to reduce investment in developing new cancer drugs by 9 times the amount that Biden's so-called moonshot increased it. And they didn't even say, we're going to put more funding in to make up for what we're doing to the private sector.
No, that's crazy. That's Phil Kerpen from American Commitment. Phil, thank you. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad to take your phone calls. And in case you haven't guessed it, I have had it up to here with drag queen shows, especially drag queen shows aimed at children. That one they've gone beyond the pale. Let me give you the latest example, and then I'll get to your phone calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. If you happen to be a naysayer, somebody who disagrees with my point of view, we love naysayers on this program. So naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@larslarson.com. And if you want to, vote in our Twitter poll. Doesn't cost anything, might be habit forming. Vote only once. We vote Republican style, not Democrat style. You can't vote more than once. Just go to @LarsLarsonShow or larslarson.com. Glad to have you with me. And a big welcome to our newest talk affiliate, KIDO Talk Radio at 107.5 FM and 580 AM in Boise, Idaho, the home of Kevin Miller. Thank you very much for joining us. That's KIDO Talk Radio, joining our Lars affiliates around America. But let me talk about these kids who are being allowed to go to drag queen shows. Not just being allowed to, but what has happened is that drag queen shows are now being pushed into every corner of society. And since it's summertime, there are going to be parades in various places, and the drag queens are part of it. Even at the so-called family-friendly events. Well, guess who's had enough of it? The Tennessee General Assembly passed a law just a few months ago that criminalizes what they call adult cabaret entertainment from taking place in public or in the presence of minors. Now, I think that's incredibly sensible. What's happened is that there's a theater that's based in Memphis, Tennessee. Our friends who listen to Todd Starnes' show in Memphis are going to recognize it. It's called Friends of George, which is an LGBTQ plus theater group. They sued over this law, and they claimed that it violates their First Amendment rights. Apparently, the First Amendment gives you not just the right to express yourself or to engage in speech or dance or any of that, But apparently they believe that it actually gives you the right to do that in front of children. Well, a federal judge has ruled that a first-in-the-nation Tennessee law that ought to be copied by every one of the 50 states, 58 if you're an Obama fan, that limits drag shows in public or in places where children could be present is unconstitutional. They actually shot it down. The decision came down late on Friday. U.S. District Judge Thomas Parker, appointed by President Trump, wrote that the law was unconstitutionally vague and substantially overbroad, and that it infringes on the First Amendment rights of drag performers. So I'd put the question to you this way. You have a right to do and say things. Now, you can't do things that are threatening, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, that sort of thing, staging a fake terrorist attack, or sending somebody white powder in an envelope. All of those are sensible limitations on the First Amendment. And anybody who tells me that, well, the First Amendment has no limits, it's absolute. No, it's not. All of the 10 amendments, in fact, all constitutional amendments, are subject to time, place, and manner restrictions. We've talked about this on the program before. It means that you have to have some limits on First Amendment free speech, but the limits have to be narrowly tailored. The problem is the assault on kids in this country is so broad that over the last several years, and it has been going on a lot in recent years, you've seen drag queen story hour at public libraries, and then drag queen story hour and other drag queen events brought into high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. We even talked about the fact that the Pentagon was allowing drag queen shows at Nellis Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas. Finally, the Pentagon shut that down. But the military these days has apparently gone woke under the Joe Biden administration. And now even the effort of a state to try to make sure that children are protected has been ruled to be unconstitutional. I think that's dead wrong. Let me grab this call from Darren. Darren in Michigan. How are you, sir?
Hey, Lars. Very nice to speak with you again.
Thanks for listening on WILS.
You got her, sir. This ordeal with the, contractor mail guy going from Bethpage, New York, in Long Island to, I'm not sure how far.
He went to Pennsylvania. He went, which is not that far away. But Darren, just so people understand what we're talking about, there was a man, we talked to him on the show a couple of years ago. He's apparently kind of gone into hiding now. He drove as a contract driver for an outfit that hauls mail for the U.S. Postal Service. And he told his story on this show a couple of years ago, right before the 2020 election. He was told to pick up a whole bunch of already completed ballots and haul them off to Pennsylvania. And then he went through a weird set of circumstances where he tried to deliver the load. They said, no, you're going to have to deliver it tomorrow. And then he comes back to find that one of the trailers on his truck had just disappeared. And the Office of the Inspector General of the Postal Service did an investigation. And it seems that the story he told, as crazy as it sounded, was actually legitimate. So what do you want to say about it? I just want to bring the rest of the folks into the conversation.
No, that's good. Clarity is essential. My question is, why was one ballot, a Pennsylvania vote, so to speak, sent to New York, let alone 200 and some thousand? I mean, that right there, and nobody said, nothing to see here, or that's all they said.
Well, I could tell you why, Darren. If you were going to create a bunch of fake ballots, would it make sense to create them where you're going to use them or create them somewhere else out of view?
No, I understand the theory, and I'm on your side about the anomalies of the election. But it's like, no, wait a minute, why do we have postmarks or whatever from another state for our election, whether it's 10 miles away, state line, or across the country? So
it doesn't. None of this stuff makes sense, Darren. In the same way that in November of 2020, when they told all the election workers who were counting ballots at the Staples Center, we're going to shut down counting for the night, and they used the excuse of a broken water main that turned out not to be broken at all. it was a leaking men's toilet in one of the urinals inside the Staples Center. And you said, why did you shut this down? Well, we had a massive water leak. No, you didn't. And we shut down counting. And then we all saw the security tapes of them taking suitcases full of ballots out from under tables. None of those questions have been adequately answered at this point, Darren. I think what we're left to conclude is that there was cheating in 2020. There was probably less of it in 2022 because a lot of states saw what happened in 2020 and they changed the laws to try to shut down some of that cheating. And should we anticipate there will be attempts by the Democrats to cheat next fall? I could just about guarantee it. Darren, thanks for the call. Thanks for listening on WILS. Back in just a moment. Glad to get your calls. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Do you have investment properties you're considering selling and would like to learn how to defer the tax consequences? Then you need to call Equity Advantage and learn about a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange is a powerful investment tool. It enables you to keep a property's equity intact when it's used to acquire like-kind replacement property of equal or greater value and equity, even if you recently acquired the property. For over 30 years, Equity Advantage has been providing investors solutions for deferring taxes and maximizing the value of investments through a 1031 exchange. At Equity Advantage, we don't sell investments, but rather provide the tax deferment tools and expertise to facilitate their sale and transfer. Learn more by going to 1031exchange.com. or Google YouTube Equity Advantage for in-depth videos. Listen, you've worked hard for the money in your investments. Equity Advantage works hard to keep it yours.
Learn more about 1031 exchanges and Equity Advantage at 1031exchange.com. That's 1031exchange.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. So we give our money to China and they get the tech for free. At least that's the way it looks like to me, except literally Americans may be shocked that while President Joe Biden will talk about all the things that Russia's doing and all the sanctions that he's going to have against Russia, and then you find out that we have a whole bunch of money, American taxpayer money, that's going both to Russia and to China. And the man who dug all that out is Adam Andrzejewski, who's CEO and founder of Open the Books, the fired former columnist at Forbes magazine. Adam, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Lars. Great to be here.
So you dug all this out, and this is not a small amount of money that we're sending to both communist China and to Russia, correct?
Yeah, we shouldn't be borrowing money from China to pay China. That doesn't make any sense. So it was U.S. Senator Joni Ernst, her team, and our team of auditors at OpenTheBooks.com, and we found $1.3 billion of U.S. taxpayer money flowed to China and Russia over the course of the past 5 years. And here's why it's important, Lars. The Government Accountability Office, they were first tasked by Congress to get the amount of U.S. taxpayer money flowing into China over the past 5 years, and they found 48 million. We found 10 times as much. So it's amazing how fast the U.S. federal government loses track of taxpayer dollars.
Why? Okay, now people are going to want to know, well, what is this money being spent on? And isn't that where the story gets a whole lot worse?
It does get worse at every turn. So let's take some examples from China. In the American School Lunch Program, this program was created to use domestic agricultural production and put it into healthy lunches for children at the poverty line or 130% below the poverty line. Domestic agriculture, and $1.6 million actually went to China for their ag exporters. And so that's got people really fired up. You've got...
Stop for a second, Adam. I hate to interrupt. So am I to understand that American taxpayers send their money to D.C., they then send a relatively small amount, but $1.6 million that we give to China to make the people who grow food in China better able to sell it to other people in the world, including the United States? We're paying to help market their farm goods against our farm goods?
Right into our National School Lunch Program, yes. And and it's a sub-grant, so it was hidden. So the USDA didn't even know that U.S. taxpayer money from the United States Department of Agriculture through the children's nutrition program was flowing on subgrants into China. They reached out. It was news to them. It's a subgrant from the state of California, the Department of Education. So now we have Freedom of Information sunshine requests into them to get the subcontract details on why U.S. taxpayer money is flowing through the state of California to Chinese ag exporters competing against our, on money earmarked for our domestic agricultural farm community.
Well, it sounds like, and there's no indication that the people in California didn't know exactly where the money was going. They knew where it was going. Am I right?
Well, in California state government, you would think so, right? So we're going to get to the bottom of it. This story's not over. What we have found is that the federal government, they sometimes track the first tier of subgrants. They never track, Lars, the second tier and the third tier. So U.S. Senator Joni Ernst now has legislation to change that, especially into the adversarial nations, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, to track second and third tier subgrants.
Well, and by the way, the fact that the people within the system know that the second, third, and fourth tiers are not being tracked means that seems like an open invitation to say, bring the money into our program, we'll throw it into another sub-program, then they'll send it somewhere that never would have been approved by the U.S. Congress. Am I right?
Yes, and here's the standard on every single dime of taxpayer money. The standard should be every dime online in real time. The technology exists. It just takes the political will, and U.S. Senator Joni Ernst's bill would go a long way to create that. And here's exactly why it's necessary. There isn't one single entity in all of world history, probably, that's gotten more scrutiny, especially over the course of the last 3 years, than the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yep.
Yet we found additional money never disclosed on these second and third tier grants going into the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. And it goes right, some of these things go, are material because of the lab leak theory. For example, we've got sub-awards from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, a U.S. government agency, through NIH on a grant to electroshock mice in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We've got 1.1 million on a sub-agreement through EcoHealth Alliance, of all people, through the U.S. Foreign Aid Agency, USAID, for coronavirus experiments. Here's what this is for. It was to identify known and unknown coronaviruses in wildlife that could make the leap to humans. Exactly material to the conversation on U.S. funding and whether or not there's a lab leak at Wuhan. This stuff needs transparency.
Well, and by the way, Adam, I know you're, depending on how your organization is funded, you may want to stay away from blatant politics. But over 2 years ago, we started looking into, as much as we could, Hunter Biden's ties to EcoHealth Alliance, because he would put money into a pandemic firm that then had deals with EcoHealth Alliance. So you understand how this happens is if the U.S. government is giving money that gets channeled to EcoHealth Alliance, how do they keep that money flow going? Well, it helps to have friends in high places, right? So all of a sudden, if you find out that your EcoHealth Alliance is doing deals with other groups that Hunter Biden's invested in, and he's got a friend who's vice president at the time, all of a sudden it's not hard to, you don't need a crayon and construction paper to connect those dots.
Well, that's very interesting, Lars. Here's, some additional context to all of that. So in a committee hearing in Congress, in the U.S. Senate in May of 2021, Dr. Anthony Fauci told the senators, in responding to questions about research at the Wuhan Institute, he said, quote, Chinese grantees awarded are very competent and trustworthy scientists. Now, okay, so here's the chaser. We identified NIH spent $300,000 in 2021 at the height of the pandemic on ethics training for Chinese scientists. And the reason that we found in the paperwork was that China was found woefully short on safety, integrity, and honest reporting. The key problems included, quote unquote, research misconduct, inadequate ethical review, neglect for human subjects and protections, and publication fraud.
All of that. And by the way, 2 years before the pandemic started, I remember during the pandemic, fairly early on, we found out that the U.S. State Department, with its consulate, with our embassy in China, was sending reports saying, hey, by the way, these labs are really sloppy. And that report went back to the State Department before, 2 years before the pandemic. We're told, hey, these folks run a sloppy operation, and it's a biosafety level 4 lab. It's not the place you can afford to be sloppy. And then you find out they've got ethical problems. Why? Because I'll bet their Chinese communist masters in Beijing say, we want results, produce results. Adam, it is always a pleasure. You always open people's eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lars.
Father's Day is right around the corner. Get Dad what he really wants, Omaha Steaks. It's Lars, perfectly aged, always tender, guaranteed delicious. The Father's Day experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easy to put a smile on the big guy's face this summer with hand-selected packages. Head over to omahasteaks.com, use my name, Lars, at checkout, and get $30 off your qualifying order. You can choose from a variety of mouth-watering packages that include fork-tender bacon-wrapped filet mignon or other gourmet grillables like air-chilled boneless chicken breasts, burgers, jumbo franks, and many more. Don't forget to save room for dessert. Most gift packages come with 4 delicious caramel apple tartlets. I get hungry just talking about it. Go to omahasteaks.com. Use my name, Lars, at checkout and get $30 off for an unforgettable gift guaranteed to make Dad's day. Because if there's one thing we know, it's Dad's one steak. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code Lars at checkout. Minimum order required. See site for details. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. And if you decide you want to set me straight, why, naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. I got to tell you my bias, my dog in the fight in this one. I own guns, have for most of my life, and I believe in the Second Amendment. I also serve unpaid on the board of directors of the Crime Prevention Research Center, which is headed up by my friend, Dr. John Lott. I don't get a dime for it. I do it because I love the organization. He is the author of many great books, including More Guns, Less Crime. But we want to talk about Hunter Biden and the fact that Hunter Biden has a major league problem with both cocaine, or did, and also had a problem with owning guns and having them tossed in trash cans only to be rescued by the Secret Service. And the fact that Joe Biden himself may find himself under investigation on a law that says you can't own a gun, you can't buy a gun if you're a user of illegal narcotics, which is a law that I'm sure Joe Biden would like to get rid of, except when it comes to his kit. Dr. Lott, welcome back.
It's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
So, as Politico put it, Hunter Biden could soon find himself in a surprising position at the cutting edge of a fight to strengthen the Second Amendment. How's this all going to come about? And why is it that Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, has never been prosecuted for apparently illegally buying a gun, then having the gun thrown away by his now ex-wife, thrown in a trash can, and then the gun retrieved by the helpful Secret Service? Why is it that the kind of thing that usually gets people thrown in prison in this country, buying guns illegally when you're an illegal user of drugs, has not done that to Hunter Biden?
You know, this should be an incredibly easy case to go and prosecute. You have Hunter Biden's own words admitting that he was consuming illegal drugs. There's lots of other evidence there. The 4473 form that you have to fill out merely asks whether or not you've been using controlled substances that are banned. And, you know, obviously, even with the laptop and other things, there's even more evidence beyond just other statements from President Biden himself that his son was using it, as well as Hunter. So it really shouldn't be a question up for debate. And it's an issue of perjury. You go and you sign the form, the 4473, under threat of perjury, that everything that you're putting down there is accurate. So if it were you or I doing that, and they had anywhere near the amount of evidence, we'd be prosecuted. What's happening right now, though, is this whole thing could be mute to some extent because the Biden Department of Justice seems to be slow walking this case. I mean, I was working in the Department of Justice up until January 2021. I think any other case, this would have been handled in a manner of literally just weeks to make a decision whether or not to challenge it. But here we're going on years. And in fact, they may be hitting the statute of limitations very soon, which simply these delays may protect Hunter Biden from being prosecuted. But if they do prosecute him, you can see that they realize that they have really no defense. And so what they're talking about is using the Bruin decision from last year, which struck down New York State's concealed carry laws. They had these so-called may issue type rules where you had to go and get permission from some local public official for arguing that you had a good reason for being able to go and protect yourself outside your home.
Right.
But the key thing there is in Justice Thomas's decision, they said there's a rule that you use to determine whether or not a gun control law is constitutional or not. And that is, you go look at the Second Amendment. If it's not clear from the Second Amendment whether it's constitutional or not, you go look at the debate. And if that's not clear, you go and look to see what rules were in effect, either in 1791 when the Second Amendment was adopted, or in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was enacted, which applied the Bill of Rights to the states. And the thing is, you didn't have background checks at either of those points in time. And so Hunter Biden apparently wants to argue, if in fact he gets charged, that background checks are unconstitutional. Now, I think he's going to have a hard time arguing that, because while you had 4 justices that were in sync with Justice Thomas on that, including Thomas, you didn't have 5 votes for that. You had 2 others, Kavanaugh and Roberts, who said that they thought that Thomas was correct in terms of laying out the arguments there, but they still listed several gun control laws that they said would still be constitutional, among them background checks. So anyway, just, if they win, there'd be no gun control laws that would really pass any standard at that point.
I guess what I don't understand is this, Dr. Lott. I've signed the 4473 form any number of times, and I'm aware every time I sign it, if I wrote down my birth date wrong or wrote down my Social Security number wrong, any of that, I'm aware that false swearing, which is the written version of perjury. So it's if you sign a document that says everything like your voter registration card, it better be the right information or you can go to prison for it. How is it that this case has been slow walked for so long, even going back into President Trump's time, that the U.S. Justice Department just protects the Biden family? I understand why they wouldn't charge a sitting president with a crime. That's a policy, not a law, but it's one the DOJ sticks to, and I think it's probably not a bad idea. Otherwise, any president could be tied up in knots by all kinds of criminal charges while they're president. So they say, we'll wait till he's not. But a lot of this protected Hunter Biden before Joe Biden became president, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, people can go and read the Laptop from Hell book, which goes through a lot of the, the emails and other things that Biden had, as well as many other times where it looks like the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Secret Service went and protected him on a range of different issues, whether he had problems with prostitutes or cocaine or whatever. So, it's an amazing period of time where it looks like there's really major differences in law enforcement for whether or not you have the right name or not. People can go and read the Durham report and how the Hillary Clinton investigation was treated extremely differently than the Trump investigation. How when they had concerns, they went to Hillary Clinton and told her about the concerns that they had. But with Trump, their thing was to go and lie on court documents in order to try to spy on people on his campaign in order to get more information. It's kind of Watergate, magnified many, many times.
It's almost like the old Nixon, I think it was the Nixon quote where he said, if the president does it, it's legal. Well, now it sounds like Joe Biden could say, when I was vice president, whatever I did was legal. And while I wasn't vice president, before I became president, whatever I did was legal. And anybody associated with me, were their prosecution, because you can imagine what would have happened in Joe Biden's presidential campaign if his son was under indictment for gun crimes, even though I don't expect parents to take, to feel guilty about the actions of their kids unless they're aiding and abetting their kids. And in this case, it sounds like Joe Biden is going to protect his son, and we always expect parents to protect their kids. When you got a 50-year-old guy who's got an illegitimate child, a major league drug problem, and then commits gun crimes, and dad is one of the biggest anti-gunners in America by far, that somebody would call them out for the hypocrisy. That is Dr. John Lott. He heads the Crime Prevention Research Center, the author of More Guns, Less Crime. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. One of the things I hate the most is when news organizations decide to either invent staging, and that's where you go out to a story and you decide to stage a photograph or stage something else, or you make up quotes, or you literally make up the story you're going to tell to your audience when you say that you're reporting news. Now, one of the things we brought up right after Ukraine was invaded by Russia is Ukraine has a really sketchy history when it comes to Nazis, because Ukraine has always been a country kind of caught in the middle between Western Europe and Russia. And during World War II, they originally sided against the Nazis, and then they decided to pick a side and said, our side is going to be the Nazi side. So there were an awful lot of people in Ukraine's government back then at the time of World War II who were full-blown Nazis. Okay, now we know that as a piece of history. Is that still relevant today? Apparently it is. And I brought up the fact that a number of reporters had covered the fact that some of the units within the Ukrainian military, where you have people cheering on Ukraine saying, Ukraine's got to win, Russia's got to lose. And when those of us like me brought up the fact that very good reporters had cited the fact that a number of the battalions that were right on the front lines in the eastern parts of Ukraine that were the first places invaded by Russia were Nazis. The Azov battalion, for example. And in fact, in about 2016, there was a bill that was passed by the U.S. Congress saying we're going to help out foreign military units, but we're not putting any money into the Azov battalion. And why is that? Because they're a bunch of Nazis. So then you see this, and I'll cite my source on this one. We still haven't managed to pry loose enough time to talk to Matt Taibbi. But Matt Taibbi, who is a bit of a left-winger, he's kind of a progressive, but he seems like a really solid journalist. He's one of those people I admire the most, like Jonathan Turley and others, who, even though their personal politics are very left and very progressive, they're willing to be a really good lawyer or a really good journalist and just tell the darn story. Well, here's what's happened. Taibbi points out that the New York Times released in its own pages a small, as he describes it, a small but disgusting detail about the New York Times reporting in Ukraine. Now, I've told you before a little bit of the inside baseball about how journalism works in America. Here's what happens. The biggest newspapers in America, or the things that used to be called newspapers, now it's mostly online, would do stories. And that story, or those stories, were then picked up by both the Associated Press and UPI, United Press International. UPI, for the most part, doesn't exist anymore. It's technically still alive, but it's really not there. The AP is a cooperative of news organizations, meaning it's not a private company. There are newspapers and TV networks that are private companies. The AP is what they call a co-op, a cooperative, where all the members, TV stations, radio stations, online news outlets, and the rest, all put money in. But it's not a private company. It is owned by the people who use it. So how does the news get to you? For the most part, stories, especially national stories, are covered by outfits like the LA Times, the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos' newspaper, the New York Times, and other major papers. The AP then picks up their stories, and whatever spin was put on the story at the beginning, and there are very few stories that don't have a certain amount of spin to them, then goes out to every radio station in America, every TV outfit in America, whether it's on cable or broadcast, It goes out to all the different news. And if you wonder, why is it that so many of these stories seem so very similar? It's because of that arrangement. The stories start at the big operations. They go on to the wire service. They then go from the wire service to every other place. And once there's a spin on a story, I've been in newsrooms before where I came back in and told the boss, this is the story. And he says, I read the Associated Press version. It doesn't sound at all like what you're reporting. I'd say, trust me, boss, my story is solid. They're off base. And that happens more often than you'd think. Consider what Taibbi points out. The New York Times just released a story that in its headline says Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issues of history, and about whether or not it means anything that some Ukrainian soldiers have been photographed wearing Nazi, it's called the Totenkopf. It means the Nazi death head symbol. And one passage from the story cited by Taibbi, he says stands out. In November, during a meeting with New York Times reporters near the front lines, a Ukrainian press officer, so he's a guy who works with the military on behalf of the Ukrainian government, he himself wore a Totenkopf, a Nazi death head symbol that was made by a company called R3ICH. It looks like Reich. And he said he did not believe the patch was affiliated with the Nazis. A second press officer said journalists had asked soldiers to remove the patch before photographs were taken. Now, that's when my back went up. Because whether you know this or not, some of us in the journalism trade, both now as an opinion journalist and then as a reporter, felt very strongly about not presenting people with things that were fake. So we would sometimes show up at a story and the police would say, well, you know, when the guy got here, he dropped his gun over here and the knife over there. Well, they'd already taken the gun and knife into evidence. And sometimes, not often, they'd say, hey, do you want us to put the gun back on the ground and the knife back on the ground so you can take pictures, video or still pictures? And we'd say, nope, we don't fake anything, period. Now, no matter how you feel about the press, when one of the biggest news organizations in America is admitting that it took photographs in which the journalists asked the soldiers to take the patch off before they took photos. And he says the institutional obstacles to getting clear information about the war in Ukraine are formidable, from embedding rules that bar journalists from entering so-called red zones and requiring escorts in yellow zones to casualties undercounted by officials on both sides to the open use of planted stories to harassment of any reporters who go against the official message. Journalists asking soldiers to remove Nazi patches is a new level of insanity. With the line between propagandist and reporter all but dissolved, how long before the embeds are offered NATO uniforms? Who thinks this is a good idea? And let me give you an example that I think really brings the point. Let's say, I don't think it's true in Joe Biden's military, but let's say there was a unit in the American military. And let's say members of that unit were allowed, I don't think they would be, but were allowed to wear Confederate flag patches on their uniforms. And you say it really doesn't mean what you're associating with, but let's take the patch off while the reporters take the pictures, and then you can put the patch back on. That's the closest comparison I could think of where you might see actual manipulation, because the New York Times knows that if they put a picture of a Ukrainian frontline outfit that is there wearing Nazi symbols and talking in terms of Nazi language and Nazi ideas, that's not going to go over well back at home. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.